Hello, everyone. Welcome to our forum, Lives and Livelihoods, War in Ukraine and What's Next. My name is Xiaohua Yang. I am the Director of China Business Studies Initiative. We also call it CBSI. I'm also Professor of International Business in the School Management here at the University of San Francisco. CBSI is proud to host today's event. CBSI is a San Francisco, Silicon Valley-based thought leader, knowledge hub, and bridge builder for businesses in Asia Pacific and the rest of the world. We regularly host events like this one. For those of you who do not know anything about University of San Francisco, let me share a couple of things. USF is a 166 years old Jesuit university. It is the second oldest university in California. USF School Management will celebrate its centennial in 2024. It has been accredited by AACSB since early 1950s. Today's event is a product from a by invitation only roundtable discussion on war in Ukraine and the impact of economic sanctions, CBSI hosted on March 7th, after Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. 30 experts around the world were brought together to share thought-provoking views, and we were asked to have a follow-up event to discuss the next steps in the war in Ukraine. Here we are today. The cruelty of war continues to unfold. My heart broke when I watched a 9-year-old Ukrainian war singing, "I want to draw my life," and begging for peace. 69 days have passed since the war started. The war now is at a turning point, which bears the potential for conflicts on a global scale, nuclear war, or even Third World War. The world is facing a few pressing questions. What can we do to stop the war? What outcomes have those sanctions produced so far? What more could be done? Multinational companies have exuded Russia and curtailed dealings with Russia elsewhere. So who got hurt most by these sanctions? Traditionally neutral countries have changed their stance on Russia. What's next? Where is China in all of this? Is the world saying a Nazi-like regime in rise, in which Russians become warmongers to fight for their lives and livelihoods? I eagerly await our distinguished speakers' thoughts on this and other questions. A couple of housekeeping matters. Detailed bios will be in the chat box as the speakers come up speak. Please post your question in the Q&A box. At this point in time, I would like to have the pleasure to bring my dear colleague and CBSI Executive Board member, Dr. Gleb Nikotenko. Gleb is a Ukrainian American born in Ukraine, and 2 other colleagues in our school are also Ukrainians. Gleb, we pray for the safety of your friends and family in Ukraine and for a quick end to this senseless war in your lovely country. Gleb will share with all of us what it is like to be a Ukrainian in this war. Gleb, it's your floor now.
Thank you very much, Professor Yan, and appreciate the esteemed panelists gathering today for the next installment of our Livelihoods War in Ukraine, the next steps. So appreciate the audience. joining us today, and of course our esteemed panelists and their expertise and incredible insight that they will offer today. So as Professor Young mentioned, being a Ukrainian American puts kind of a different sense of both responsibility as well as I guess reaction. It's wonderful to see such an outpouring of support from all different parts of the world, and especially here in the United States. It's amazing to see Ukrainian flags waving in small towns in the United States, literally tiny little villages and towns where population may not exceed 100 people. You see an Ukrainian flag and you start thinking, well, maybe there are Ukrainians in this village, only to realize it's just the power of the message and the notion of this epic battle between forces, we would like to think, forces of democracy all around the world and freedom with autocracy, with totalitarianism, with medieval military and political techniques, and literally everything else that unfortunately Russia has come to represent over the last 2 months. The war has raged on for 2 months. It was originally supposed to be completed in 3 to 4 days, well, up to a week. That's what now the intelligence has revealed as far as the Russian plans. However, that has not come to fruition, and Ukraine is still fighting, and the territory that's been captured, invaded, are basically remaining more or less the same. Russia has not advanced. It has come to the world's attention that the Russian army is nowhere near the power and strength that was projected, and propaganda has worked on it for years, quite successfully. Nevertheless, has revealed that the giant has clay legs, kind of an old expression. And Putin, the President Putin, is running out of alternatives. You could tell that they're kind of moving tactically. They had a range of alternatives, and pretty much all of them either have shut down or have presented more negative outcomes that they originally thought. And this is becoming a problem because the leadership, the power in Russia, or power elite, has become more desperate, and a desperate person, a desperate man, is a dangerous stakeholder, dangerous actor in the world arena. And of course, the world arena has changed. We are at the brink of a major disruption. We were talking about this for years. It's just no one realized that it would come in a sort of in the shape of a war. We are at the stage of major economic changes, world economic changes, political changes, of course, military changes, new alliances are appearing, new economic models are being tested. In fact, the whole world economic model has been put through a stress test, and we still don't know what the outcomes might be. And of course, ultimately, which would probably be one of the themes today, is the Chinese role, China's role, which is so much watched these days. And we are looking with both hope as well as with worry, because China has been maneuvering. They, just like I mentioned last time when we met, the Chinese are watching. They're kind of trying to assess the situation and literally leave as much room for maneuver as they can. The rhetoric is changing from more pro-Russian. It has shifted to more neutral, and now the Chinese television channels are actually showing some examples of atrocities in Ukraine, in addition to, of course, adding some Russian propaganda narratives. So you see a real mix. You see a balance, and where this balance may be moving towards is something for our esteemed experts today to discuss, among other things. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Gleb, for such an insider view. Very powerful message to China. So let me now turn to Mary Teagarden to start the fireside chat now. It is my great privilege and a pleasure to introduce my lifelong colleague and friend, Dr. Mary Teagarden, Deputy Dean and Professor of Global Strategy, Thunderbird School of Global Management at Arizona State University. And she's also CBSI Advisory Board member. Mary is a China legend and has worked in that space for many decades. Please refer to her bio in the chat box, and Mary will introduce Ambassador Craig Allen. Mary.
Thank you very much, Xiaohua. I'm looking forward to learning with you in this fireside chat with Ambassador Craig Allen about what the future might hold and develop some understanding about the rationale for what's happening. I'm going to mix up the order of the questions that appear in the program, but first I'd like to speak a little bit about Ambassador Allen. Ambassador Allen has had a career of service. He has worked as a senior commercial officer and a senior foreign service officer. Very challenging jobs, and jobs that certainly lubricate a lot of the business that goes on around the world, a lot of global business. He is currently serving as the president of the US-China Business Council and has a lot of interesting perspective to share with us. So, Ambassador, I'm going to begin with my first question, and that is, why does Putin not want to see Ukraine under a democratic political system?
Well, firstly, thank you so much, Mary and Xiaohua, for this opportunity. Wonderful to be with you. So on February 4 of this year, during the Beijing Olympics, President Putin and President Xi signed a 17-page agreement. And in that agreement, there is a lot of discussion about the future of China-Russian relations. But one thing that is quite peculiar from an Americanized perspective about this document is that both President Xi and President Putin very much extol and the virtues of democracy. They claim that both countries are democratic in their own way and also great republics. And I think it's important to see the world from their eyes. So if I may, I'll just quote the document. China and Russia share the understanding that democracy is a universal human value rather than a privilege of a limited number of states, and that its promotion and protection is a common responsibility of the entire world community. So therefore, from their perspective, they are democratic countries. And they would define this through performance of government, that they consult with the people and that therefore, ipso facto, they're democratic. Now, I don't say that to excuse them or to it's not my job to apologize, but rather to understand the perspectives from which they are approaching this. And it's important, if for no other reason than to try and find a way to resolve the situation, to understand their propaganda and their messaging, so that we can get inside of that messaging to reach some form of a conclusion that is sustainable. So both in the February 4 document, it also states that China and Russia stand against attempts by external forces to undermine the security and stability in their common adjacent regions. And I'd like to underline common adjacent regions, because it's not only in China and in Russia It is, quote unquote, in their common adjacent regions. And certainly Ukraine would classically fall in the definition of their common adjacent regions. So from a Russian perspective, Russia is a democratic country that is attacking what they say is quote unquote nationalism in Ukraine. And I think that we need to understand that if we're to find a diplomatic solution. And at the end of the day, only a diplomatic solution is going to work here. And we need to get into their reference points so that we're able to draw the suffering and the violence to an end as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The second question I'd like you to reflect on for us is, what's the role of the West in this conflict? And also, why was NATO part of this picture?
Sure. I do think that Samuel Huntington's classic book, The Clash of Civilizations, is really a very useful analytical tool as we look at the role of the West, the role of Russia, and Ukraine's unfortunate position very much between the two of them. Ukraine is a classic border state caught between Russia, Europe, and Turkey, if not the Middle East. And in eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine, there are many Russian speakers. So the country has a very strong pull to Europe, but also a strong pull simultaneously to both Russia and to the Middle East. And this process has been going on for a long time. I think that we could recall the 1930 to 1933 man-made famine sponsored by Stalin in Ukraine, in which 3.5 to 7 million people died. That is almost within living memory, less than 100 years ago. And that is certainly a part of the Russian Ukrainian legacy, an important part. So it is not surprising, given the Holodomor, that almost Holocaust-like experience of the Ukrainians in the 30s, that the Ukrainians pine to be a part of Europe. It's not surprising at all. And certainly since the Maidan revolution of 2014, it has been headed in that direction, looking to join the EU and looking to join NATO. Now, it was not that long ago, about a year ago, that President Zelensky was in Washington requesting of Joe Biden that Ukraine be allowed to join Europe, NATO. And Joe Biden at that time said, well, not really, not quite yet. We'll talk about it later. So do the Russians have legitimate concerns that Ukraine would wish to join the EU and NATO? Well, absolutely. Ukraine wishes to join the EU and NATO. Now, from a Russian perspective, it's astonishing how much, if you will, territory or allied states that were previously a part of the Soviet Union or the Iron Curtain have joined NATO. So there are 13 countries that had been part of the Soviet bloc that are currently NATO members. Albania, Bulgaria, Croatia, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, North Macedonia, Poland, Slovakia, and Slovenia. So the Russians perceived that Ukraine wished to join that list, and they wish to stop it. So from the Russian perspective, and this propaganda is being amplified by the Chinese, it was Ukraine's imminent acceptance into NATO that forced the Russians to move. Now, none of that is true, but from a Russian perspective, that was the cause belli. So again, I'm trying to understand Russian and Chinese propaganda and trying to interpret it in the search for a potential resolution, because we're not going to be able to resolve this situation without understanding their point of view.
This is so important, that developing that deep understanding is the first step towards solution. The other thing I would like you to talk about is what's China's position given its tense relationship with the US?
So I do think that the May 4th document, February 4th document, which is available for everyone to read, and I highly recommend that you go to the original source and look at it. It states very clearly what President Xi and President Putin would like to see in the future. And again, let me quote it, because their words are better than mine. They state that, quote, Russia and China stand against the formation of closed bloc structures and opposing camps in the Asia-Pacific region, and remain highly vigilant about the negative impact of the United States Indo-Pacific strategy on peace and stability in the region, end quote. And so clearly, this relationship between Russia and China is very much focused on what is perceived to be a common threat from the United States and NATO. So the Chinese and the Russians are working together. And indeed, here within Washington, there is a lot of talk about one theater now, that the PLA and the Russian army have the potential to work closely together. Now, I want to be clear that there's no evidence that they are doing so in Ukraine now, but certainly it is envisioned in the future that they will. Now, I think that the defining phrase within that all-important February 4 document is, and let me quote and kind of underline and bold this, that friendship between the two states, that is Russia and China, has no limit. There are no forbidden areas of cooperation between China and Russia. And I think that friendship between the two sides has no limits, and no forbidden areas of cooperation should give us all pause to consider what are the implications of that. And the document kind of tells us, it says that the sides reaffirm their intention to strengthen foreign policy coordination across all levels of all dimensions of multilateral affairs. And so I think that that's what we're seeing. If the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs were on this call, I think that they would say, yeah, we are implementing the February 4 document. They are not providing military support to Russia, but they are providing all sorts of other moral and rhetorical support that is actually quite effective in particularly in the third world. So that said, I wouldn't say that China and Russia's relationship is an alliance or a union or anything like that. It's much more of a marriage of convenience. Both countries are very resentful, feel that they are victims, feel that the United States and NATO, if you will, is not respecting their prerogatives and challenging the very legitimacy of the two regimes. So I think that there's a commonality of ground where both are very resentful against the United States and NATO. But that doesn't mean that China and Russia don't have a huge number of problems on their own that will slow down that relationship. I think that we have to remember to the end of the Qing dynasty, when in Chinese eyes, hundreds of thousands of square kilometers were ceded to Russia in an unfair treaty between Tsarist Russia and Qing China. And today, there are a myriad problems between the two. And certainly the invasion of Ukraine by Russia is probably very unwelcome by Beijing because it puts Beijing in a very awkward position vis-a-vis the United States, but more importantly, Europe. China and the United States' relations today are icy cold. And the Chinese are not spending a lot of calories trying to improve that bilateral relationship. But the relationship between China and Europe is very important to the Chinese. And I think it is for that reason that the Chinese will probably continue to not provide arms or weapons to the Russians that could be used in Ukraine. And in addition to that, that if they did, I think that they recognize that surely sanctions would follow, not only by the US, but also by Europe. And that's something that they would wish to avoid. Therefore, thus far, they've been scrupulous, so far as we know, at living up to the sanctions, and we hope that will continue.
One last question here. In the context of your comments so far, what does this mean for high-tech industries?
So I think that we are already seeing a decoupling between China and the United States and Russia in many high-tech sectors. Both China and the United States wish to be global leaders throughout the high-tech industries. And both are right today, currently, we have a really interesting mix of interdependence and synergy, cooperation, and also very fierce competition in all the high-tech industries. And Ray Ma, who we'll hear from later, is really the expert in this. But at least in my view, the decoupling process that has been underway for some time now will continue, and indeed may be accelerated by the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And the pace of that decoupling, the scope and the breadth and the depth of that decoupling may be determined by the degree to which the Chinese actually support the Russians in the Ukraine, on the Ukraine battlefield. If the Chinese support the Russians in Ukraine, decoupling will go a lot faster than if not. Even without that, I think that we see a process of decoupling in semiconductors, in 5G telephony, and in other areas that probably we should expect to continue if not at a rapid pace, then at a slower pace. And indeed, I'll end by saying it seems that both governments welcome that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments and insights. I think you have helped build the understanding for all of us in the audience.
Thank you.
I appreciate your contributions. At this point, we're going to hand it over to Kerr Gibbs. And Kerr, you will have the floor.
Welcome back. Welcome back to part 2 of our discussion today. What we're going to do now is go a little bit more in depth on some of the topics that we've just discussed. My name is Kerr Gibbs. I'm an executive in residence at the University of San Francisco, and I'll be the host for the next 45 minutes or so of discussion. At this point in the conflict, it seems, as we've been talking about with our previous speakers, we're now more than 2 months into this conflict, and it's clear that the solution is not going to be quick, and it is not going to be simple. That much is clear. Also, some of the early hopes that many people had that China would use its enormous political power, market power, and influence over Russia and Vladimir Putin. It seems clear that some of our early hopes that they would play a constructive role in bringing in a quick end to the conflict, that apparently is not going to happen. But still, as we heard from Ambassador Craig Allen and others, there's still a role that they can play. So that's going to be an interesting part of the discussion to look for. And lastly, we want to go deeper into the sanctions and understand in what way the sanctions are effective, in what way they're not effective, and back to our theme for today about lives and livelihood, what kind of impact are these sanctions having on the rest of us? So what we've done is we've brought together 4 people who are all experts in their particular field, and they all have a great deal of knowledge and insight to contribute to this discussion. We've also put a lot of effort into bringing a diverse panel of experts. You'll see that we have people from academia, but also from the business world. We've also tried to achieve diversity in terms of some of the experts are very, very deep in European affairs, which is where this conflict is taking place. But then we have 2 people that have more depth from the China side to lend their expertise. Our panel discussion is going to be informal, so with their permission, we're going to use first names, and also I want everybody in the audience to get ready with questions. So this is going to be very much a participation kind of exercise here. So get ready with your questions and just go ahead and put them into the chat box there at any time, and we can start collecting the questions, and then we'll turn to your questions after we've heard from each of the panelists. So I'm going to first bring the panelists in one by one and introduce them, and then have them launch into their first question of the day. So I'm going to start with you, if you don't mind, Professor Stan Marcus. I'm going to start with you, and Professor Marcus, has a very distinguished academic background with degrees from Harvard and UPenn. He is now a professor at the University of South Carolina. He speaks Russian and Ukrainian, and I understand he has some background in Chinese as well. Professor Marcus, his areas of research and expertise that we want to tap into are really around political risk, but he's also looked into the role of oligarchs. And we're going to come back to that point in a minute. But to start things off, Stan, if I may, can you kind of get us started by help us get inside the head of Vladimir Putin, if you can, and how do you think he assesses the situation now? The situation is very different from where it started, where he apparently thought that this would be a quick what is he calling it, exercise or something. Clearly that's not the case. So what are his options and what are his objectives at this point, now that it's fairly clear that that he's not going to be able to take the whole country in its entirety, certainly not quickly? Where do you think he is headed, Stan?
Thank you, Craig. Thank you, Kerr. You know, Putin's head is a dangerous and confusing place, but let's try to navigate through it. So first of all, Putin made 3 very wrong estimates about the war. He first vastly overestimated the capacity of Russia's armed forces. This is a result of Russia being a kleptocracy and an autocracy. The fact that Russia is a kleptocracy meant that military designated funds were embezzled. And of course, the fact that it's an autocracy means that people who are Putin's subordinates were afraid of reporting the true state of the war on the battlefield. Second, Putin also vastly misjudged the willingness and capability of Ukraine to resist. And finally, he underestimated Western resolve, unity, and ability to inflict pain on Russia effectively on Ukraine's behalf. Now, in terms of the military and other directions in the future, several points to mention. First, in terms of the military, I think the minimal plan, the minimal satisfactory plan for Putin is to capture and control the Donbas and Lugansk oblasts, that is the Eastern Russian-speaking Ukraine, beyond the smaller separatist regions that had been de facto controlled by Russia before the war. This is the minimal plan. The maximum plan at this point is to control all of Eastern and Southern Ukraine. That means including Mariupol, Odessa, and Kharkiv. So in other words, Russia would control the entire Black Sea coast all the way to Moldova. And on the eastern side, it would control not only Donbas and Lugansk, but also Kharkiv. This would be the ambitious plan. Now, the second point about the future that I would like to mention is that May 9 is a very important date for Russia. It's a politically significant date. I think the Chinese equivalent here would be, for example, the CCP Congress at the end of the year. So the same significance is attributed to Russia's Victory Day in World War II, which Russia celebrates on May 9. So what this means for Putin is that he has to produce some sort of victory literally in the next 5 days, right? And so the question is, how can he do that? Now, Putin understands very well the difference between substantive victory and the semblance of a victory. He has always been the master of controlling the narrative. Even back in the 2000s, when Russia waged a war against Chechnya, Putin actually micromanaged the television anchors in how they reported on the war. So he understands very well how to shape the message. But still, it will be very difficult for him, given Russia's very poor military performance on the battlefield, to sell what they have achieved to the Russians as a victory. So the question is, what can he do? It is a dilemma, right? Russia hasn't achieved well, but by May 9, he really needs some sort of story to tell, and it better be a success story. And I think he will resolve this dilemma by artificially inflating the threat perception among the Russian public. And this will serve as a partial excuse for Russia's poor military performance. In effect, the message might be that, look, Russia is indeed at this point at war, not just with Ukraine, not just with the so-called Nazis, as you know, the Russian propaganda has basically cast the Ukrainians or the political elites in Ukraine to be, but Russia is in fact at war with NATO-aligned countries. And here, of course, the Western response so far, very punishing sanctions, as well as very heavy military support of Ukraine, will help Putin shape this message, right? Will help Putin convince the Russians that it is the West that's the aggressive force, and that's why Russia hasn't been able to achieve all of its objectives in Ukraine. So this is in terms of shaping the narrative literally in the next several weeks. And finally, let me conclude my answer to your question with 4 big scenarios or open questions for the future that we're still waiting for. One big question is whether Russia will implement a military draft, that is a mass conscription and mass military mobilization. Again, Putin might use the date of May 9 to do precisely that, by first stating that the threat we are facing is much greater than we had imagined, and now we need a mass draft. I think Putin is aware of the risks this carries, given, for example, Russia's or the Soviet war in Afghanistan, and just how much damage the draft had done to the war's domestic support. But we'll see whether that actually takes place. The second big open question is whether Russia will use tactical nuclear weapons or chemical weapons in Ukraine. Unfortunately, we cannot rule this out because on the one hand, the West has already punished Russia pretty much as severely as it can. So Russia doesn't have much to lose on that front. And at the same time, of course, Russia hasn't performed well with its conventional forces. So there is unfortunately the possibility of a tactical nuclear weapon being detonated. Another big open question is what kind of retaliation Russia will implement against the West. And it is a big puzzle why Russia hasn't retaliated already through cyber operations, or at the very least through targeting the military supplies. But at some point, retaliation, I think, will come from Russia. And finally, my final kind of big open question here is scenarios for the global geopolitical situation, and specifically how Russia will shape the narrative for the non-aligned countries, right? Not just India and China, who of course are, oscillating between pragmatic neutrality and being implicitly pro-Russia, but also for the large chunks of Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. Russia had invested a lot of political capital in Western Europe. At this point, all of those investments are basically invalidated. And I think over time, we will see Russia shifting those investments into the developing world. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's perfect, Stan. You brought up a lot of very important points. And it's interesting. Yeah, you mentioned, the head of Vladimir Putin, it's a very dangerous and complicated place, and controlling information, right? He controls the narrative going out, but then people are controlling information coming in. So he may not be working with really good information about what's going on. So you make really good points. Let me come back to you to go deeper on some of those issues. But for now, let's bring in Mr. Pin Ni. So turning our attention from the European theater over into what's going on in China, and give us a little bit more color on what's happening there. I want to introduce Mr. Ni. He's actually the president of the Wanxiang America Corporation, which is itself a wholly owned subsidiary of a Chinese entity, Wanxiang Group, which is based in Hangzhou, China, which is a very large automotive group and employs thousands of people in the United States. Mr. Ni is also the chairman of the Chinese General Chamber of Commerce. And so that gives him just an interesting perspective on things from that position. So I'm going to ask Pin to do kind of the same thing that Stan did for the Russian side and getting inside the head of Mr. Putin. Pin, can you help us kind of understand what's happening inside the Chinese government? I know that's very difficult because it's so opaque, but what do you think this situation looks like from Beijing? You don't sit in Beijing, of course, you sit in Chicago, but you're the best we've got right now. So I wonder if you could help us understand, what do you think is happening? We know that President Xi and President Putin have a close personal relationship. Is that what's really driving this? Or do you think that 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 there are broader interests that China really wants to get out of this. And also, lastly, if I could ask you to address, do you think that President Xi and the CCP are completely aligned on policy? Any insight that you might have about that? Again, I know it's a very opaque situation, very hard, but what does China get out of this, Pin, if you would?
Thank you, Kurt. And great questions. And I wish I have all the answer, but honestly, this is very difficult. And to read and understand what China is doing, because honestly, I think China's view is evolving as well. I think we just heard, the word was used as called numeration. And it is very difficult for China today. There's many different fronts, let's put it this way. There's a principal issue. There's so-called a friendship issue, as you just mentioned. There's a national interest. As of today, for example, the food security, which is the largest issue for China as a national security. And also there's a long-term strategic geopolitical position. So, among all this, and as, you pointed out, and starting from overwhelming on, pro-Russia, then become more neutral. Now, at least we saw in the last 2-3 days, the word of invasion was used publicly in China.
Interesting.
So there are changes, but let me answer a couple of your questions. I think Ambassador Allen, did a great job to answer. Actually, he already laid the groundwork for most of your questions. So, but let me address a couple of questions you have. One is this personal friendship, how much this could impact in terms of, in those geopolitical relationships. Honestly, I would say at minimum, I could say they do not play determining factor in those relationships. And although, I have to say that a personal trust or good personal relationship will help to build a trust, which is important, to solve geopolitical conflict. But if we believe those personal relationships could dictate, how the national security issue are addressed, I think that is absolutely not true. So from that point of view, for example, one of the questions was asked many times was during the, as Ambassador Allen was talking about this February 4 document, right? When the two presidents were sitting in China in Beijing, and when they signed this agreement, was China notified about this invasion will take place, and what was China's viewpoint at the time? So we saw many times now the Ambassador Qinggang from China already, state, on the newspaper, in the interview with the media, saying that China clearly was not aware, neither China was in agreement. So I would definitely believe that, if nothing else, we don't need to talk about those, the bigger picture, but just talking about, I was shocked at the beginning when this military action was taking place. The embassy and the Chinese embassy in Ukraine was trying to calm everybody down and say, no problem, this is going to be no issue, and you don't have to worry about it. There was no plan for evacuation. So they end up with a lot of Chinese students and also a lot of Chinese workers and the business person stuck in Ukraine couldn't go back to China. And China was, this was a little embarrassment, frankly speaking, So if that was some kind of a correlation, this absolutely should not happen. So that's the one, observation. The second one, the question is always about will China support Russia, in a way that it will become military correlation. So I would agree the answer is absolutely no as well. So let's just not forget it. Just like Ambassador Allen was talking about, let's not forget the history. And even in the modern history, the last military conflict among these three countries, US, China, Russia, was between Russia and the China, Soviet Union, in the 1960s. In fact, the story in China was that Soviet Union was about ready to use nuclear weapon. And the president of the United States called, I forgot, whichever the ambassador to United Nations or whoever, and to say, if you guys do that, we're going to launch a nuclear weapon to Russia as well. So that was the one stopped that war. So anyway, so I think, again, China will be smart enough to understand there's a balance. Although, as I say, it is a very difficult position, difficult situation for China because you try to balance everything. But on the other side, as you ask the question, say, will President Xi and the CCP are fully aligned? And I would say, again, just like any other country, no matter what kind of form of democracy, there's always different opinions. That is just human nature. Whether it's surfed up on the surface or it's closed the door behind the scene, there's always different opinions. Even in Russia today, right? And no matter Putin has a 75, 80% now, there's a still very strong different view. So I would say those views are going to be there. It's just a matter whether you see that or not. And then the question is that whether this view or this opinion will matter or not. So to the large extent, I say, different view probably does not matter. We saw the Shanghai lockdown. If the view matters, probably that already got changed because, again, there's a little difference here. It's in China is all united, and then you come out with one voice. So those are different views. You got to screen it out. I'm not saying they're not to listen, they're not respected, but when you come out, there's only one voice, one view. So I think that's what we are saying today, and probably we're going to see that for the next 5, 10 years. Fortunately or unfortunately. So anyway, so that's what I can, to the best I can, based on the source I could read and understand, and but obviously, as I say, I won't be surprised if China tomorrow even be more aggressive in terms of trying to get involved to help reconcile both sides.
Yeah, interesting, Pin. That's a fascinating discussion. Yeah, as you say, there's a lot of different opinions, but it's hard to actually see them sometimes. The situation over there is so opaque. And also those opinions can shift over time. So interesting. We'll come back to you. Let's shift our focus now back to the European theater. We're going to bring in Dr. Sheila Puffer, who I understand has just returned from Europe, I think, if I'm right. Let's bring Sheila into the conversation. She's also a distinguished academic with a long list of publications to her name. She's currently a professor at Northeastern University in Boston. Her research includes Russian businesses, and she has written a book on the Soviet diaspora. So we want to tap into her expertise around some of those questions. But let me start, Sheila, if we could start with a discussion about the sanctions. If you could take us deeper on the sanctions on Russia and Russian businesses, how's that going? How much pain do you think this is actually putting on the Russian economy, and what impact do you think it's having on Putin's decision making, or really on the war machine itself, on their ability to actually wage war? What adjustments is Russia making? Help us understand that, if you would, Sheila.
Happy to do so. Thank you, Kerr. Well, first of all, a report was issued today by Germany, and their exports to Russia plummeted to their lowest level in almost 2 decades as a result of the sanctions. And so their sales for the month of March to Russia sank 63% to 860 million euros. And they attributed it to the sanctions imposed following the invasion, as well as further measures to restrict exports and unsanctioned behavior of market participants. That was conclusion by Germany's statistics office. Well, you can imagine the impact of cutting off those exports to Russia has on Russia. Germany is a huge producer of high-value, high-tech equipment, and not having access to that equipment or spare parts will have a devastating effect on the Russian economy, the ability to maintain production. It turns out, according to today's report issued by the Yale School of Management, that almost 1,000 companies have curtailed their operations in Russia, 1,000 global companies, major ones. And interestingly, Professor Jeffrey Sonnenfeld and his team at the Yale School of Management a few weeks ago issued a report that they had compiled of information regarding the impact on the bottom line of those companies that have curtailed operations in Russia. And it turns out that the ones that could curtail their operations did perform substantially better than those that stayed. For instance, the market in the first 3 weeks after the war broke out went off. The market sell-off was about 3% across major indices, whereas companies that refused to withdraw or stayed in Russia were down over 12%. So more than 3 times the hit for them. And the Yale School of Management has been maintaining a list tracking more than 1,000 global companies. And so I find that to be a good resource. Russia, of course, is being cut off from critical technology imports, which not only is curtailing production, but it contributes to a loss of investment as well as managerial and technical expertise. And we look at the huge impact of pulling out of Russia. Maersk announced today that Russia accounted for 2% of its business activities. And they are writing down all those assets so that, according to the CEO, they will have in Russia basically zero investment. And they're going to try to divest those port and warehousing assets in coming quarters. And BP, I think, really shows the huge impact that pulling out can have. Getting itself out of its partnership with Rosneft incurred a $25 billion loss just in the past week. So those are a few things about the sanctions. I can continue more, and I have some anecdotal evidence from various individuals who have been affected. But I'll leave it at that for now, if that works for you, Kurt.
Okay, thanks, Sheila. We will come back to you, and we love anecdotes. So let's come back to you in a minute. Let's first go to, let's bring in Ray Ma. And last but not least, I'm bringing in Ray. And the reason why I held her for last is she's a columnist. And so I thought she might, have comments to make about some of the things that other speakers have said. But otherwise, we can ask her to help us understand from a business perspective. So Ray Ma actually has a distinguished academic career herself in her own right, from UC Berkeley, but also from Tsinghua and others. She is a tech investor, and now, as I said, she's a columnist, so she can share her perspective on this. Ray, how do you see things shaping up here from a business perspective? And naturally, we've seen the defense contractors are obviously having their stocks are going up. But is there any other companies that are benefiting or not benefiting? And how do you see businesses reacting to the conflict in Ukraine? Right.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. I would say my expertise, because it is primarily revolving around Chinese tech companies, I can speak more specifically to, tech a little bit more broadly, but specifically Chinese tech companies. And I would say so far the impact has not been that great. And the reason is manyfold, but the main reason I would say is because Chinese tech companies, especially the listed companies, which are primarily internet companies, have been hit really hard by regulatory restrictions as well as poor macroeconomics in China. And their drop started in spring of last year, way before the Ukrainian war. So the joke actually amongst public market investors is that if you want to find worse priced companies besides ones listed on the Russian exchanges, then you can go to China Tech. So like on average, the large companies market caps over $5 billion have dropped something like 60 to 70%. So in the last year. So there isn't too much more, unfortunately, for these companies to go. The second reason is because, as I said, a lot of the companies that are listed are internet companies, and they actually don't have huge presence in Russia, right? So the one that is talked about a lot, Alibaba, for example, Alibaba actually has the supposedly the most visited e-commerce website and most downloaded shopping app in Russia in 2021, 35 million monthly active users, 10% of Russia's e-commerce market. But when you compare the revenues they're getting there to the entire group, then it's really only 1 to 2%, right? So even if, for example, they were to halt their operations there, it wouldn't have very much impact on the on the company's whole performance. And that's the case. And Alibaba is probably the most active out of all the large Chinese internet companies in Russia. So for everyone else, their exposure is even less. When you look at non-internet companies and go into hardware, semiconductors, especially because the sanctions from the U.S. are specifically about, not providing any technology to the Russian military, then you do run into semiconductor companies. But again, semiconductor companies from China, SMIC, and Huawei is not a semiconductor company, but relies heavily on semiconductors. These two companies were already very harshly sanctioned. So again, there's sort of limited ways they can fall. SMIC is probably the most interesting case that everyone's watching. It is not clear what they're doing. It does not seem like they're taking any actions to address sanctions. And they seem to continue to be doing business as usual. But there's a lot of discussion on potentially that if they were to violate sanctions to Russia, that the company could be in much bigger trouble. But realistically, if you look at what's happened in the past year or two, after sanctions from the U.S. had been put on the company, pre-Russia, their sales and net profits have actually gone up. In fact, their net profits doubled last year compared to 2020. So in some ways, the sanctions could be creating opportunity for SMIC for specific parts of its business. And it's not super clear what's going to happen going forward. The other companies that are actually enjoying a short-term boost from these sanctions are Chinese smartphone companies. So I'm not sure if people saw the headline, but in the first half of March, many of the top-selling brands in Russia, Chinese smartphones, Oppo, Vivo, Honor, which is spun out from Huawei, etc., doubled or tripled in those couple of weeks because Samsung and Apple halted supplies to the country following the invasion of Ukraine. But again, if you look at the numbers more deeply, even though those sound like really impressive increases, most of these players only had low single-digit market shares in in Russia. So even the biggest one, Realme, which is again spinoff from I think Oppo, the company's market share in China was only 6%. And sure, it went up to 12%, but almost everyone else is at 1 or even 0.5% market share. So it sounds impressive on paper, but once you dig into the details, Russia is still not that big of a market for many of the Chinese tech companies. And I'm personally not too worried about the impact of secondary sanctions on most of these industries. Not yet, anyway.
Yeah. Good, Ray. It's fascinating. Good. There's so many things going on. There's so much volatility and so many other things happening that impact the business community that this is only one of the things that impact. So it's a little bit hard to isolate the effect of this particular conflict, isn't it?
Yeah. I would say, if anything, most people I talk to feel like this is a little far away for them, but they are more concerned that this worsens U.S.-China relations and eventually impacts whatever business they're in, apart from Russia, but just basically worsens the relationship between U.S. and China. And as people who probably pay attention to the sector know, there are a lot of options the U.S. is considering and putting on the table for further curtailing Chinese tech development and capital market exits. So those are more worrisome for many of the business people.
Exactly, as if there aren't enough bad things happening in the U.S.-China relationship to begin with. Let's go back. Thank you so much, Ray. Fascinating. Stan, let's go back to you. I'm going to do something really unfair. Time is going by really fast. This is not a 2-minute question, but I'm going to ask you to, in 2 minutes or less, let's talk about NATO and let's talk about Sweden and Finland in the context of how does this change the equation? Now that they're making noises about entering NATO, how does this change the thinking of Putin? And I realize that this is a complicated question, but I'm going to ask you, 1 to 2 minutes.
Well, at the very least, we'll have to drop the term Finlandization when we try to refer to the neutral status of an entity if Finland rejoins the NATO. But more seriously, to be honest, I don't think it will have immediate repercussions aside from highlighting just how counterproductive Putin's invasion has been and how self-fulfilling his paranoia has been about NATO. But the reason it won't have immediate implications is simply because Russia is really spread too thin militarily at this point. And of course, economically, it's pinned against the wall. It's isolated economically. So Russia simply does not have the capacity to do anything militarily to kind of in protest of this move. Now, in the long run, they might try to station strategic weapons. For example, in Cuba, they have indicated they might try to do that. We'll see, but this is long term. In the short and midterm, Russia simply has, it has enough on its hands.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. You know what, let's stay with the NATO theme. Pin, let me ask you something about, and I take your point that there are a lot of different opinions in China and it's kind of a moving target. But talking about NATO, what we hear most often, some people in China kind of lay the blame for all of this on the US and say the US created the situation. Ukraine is simply doing what the US wants. And they don't say that much about that it's NATO caused the problem or that Europe caused the problem. How do you see that? Is that a misunderstanding on my part, or is there a difference between how they view this in China, the US versus Europe and NATO?
Sure. Yeah. So to a large extent, I want to borrow what Ambassador Allen was talking about. The China-Russia relationship is a marriage of convenience. So the convenience is because they have common perceived enemy, which is USA, right? So, and the US-China relationship, on the contrast, I could say, is a living together without the marriage certificate. So it's already together, no matter whether you like or not. There's no other choice, right? So from that common perceived enemy's point of view, I don't think there's a NATO here, frankly speaking. And it is very, very true to the very large extent that everybody, I would say, if there's one common perception, the perception is that Europe is just a matter of in the Chinese, we call the white glove of the United States. So, whatever NATO does, it's representing the USA interest.
Yeah.
So that is very, very clear. And also, in fact, today, they're still talking about NATO want to stop, USA may not want to stop. So that's a very bigger conversation, going on in China as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, great point. Thank you for that, Pin. Sheila, let's come back to you. We're eager to hear your anecdotes, if you can share those with us. But also, I'm going to do something very unfair. The same thing I did to Stan. In a short period of time, the energy market. This is what everybody's talking about, and we're seeing the discussion now within Europe really backing off aggressively on Russian oil. So, what can you share with us around those topics?
Thank you, Kerr. Well, first of all, Russia, as we all realize, needs to find new markets for its fossil fuels. And India is a very willing taker. However, in today's news, India said that it wants Russia to discount its oil to below $70 a barrel. And the rationale for that, according to India, is that the country wants compensation for the increasing risks with trading with Russia. And currently, price of oil is north of $100. So I think it might take a fair bit of negotiating for India to secure that kind of a discounted price. So that's one thing about energy. A second thing is, as Stan pointed out, from a political perspective, Russia has to look at potential partners or even strengthening partnerships in other parts of the world, such as Africa. And with regard to Africa, there are according to Bloomberg, Russia has signed mining and energy contracts with African countries, and for a long time they've had a presence there in military operations with private military contractor deployments and election interference. And a number of African countries have refused to condemn the war. And because of the informal military presence in countries such as Libya, Sudan, Mali, and the Central African Republic, these African countries want to keep their options open, stay friendly, and if they can continue to receive energy deliveries from Russia, I think they plan to do so.
Yeah, no, great point. Great point. Let me just ask one last question. Go to Ray. Ray, can you help us understand what are you hearing among the general public within in China? Maybe monitoring social media. What are you hearing about opinions and sort of, this follows on, some of the things that Pin had mentioned, how there's a diversity of views and it also changes. What are you seeing?
Sure, I can actually quote a survey because I think it fits nicely with my anecdotal experience. So I guess in the last week of March, the Carter Center China Focus conducted a survey on Chinese public opinion, almost 5,000 results, and almost about 75% of the respondents agree that supporting Russia is in China's national interest, and then 60% support China mediating an end to the conflict. And what's nice about the surveys, they also broke it down and try to find any factors that had statistical significance. And it turned out that education, exposure to national state media and social media all made people slightly more supportive of the Russian side. Most evident is if you consume a lot of national state media. But I would like to just point out that, like age didn't seem to have too much of a factor. Education was only very slightly, and, income level didn't really matter. And even in state media, whether or not you're consuming national level state media or local level state media, or if you're consuming, commercial media, only national state media sort of pushed you towards maybe supporting Russia. And even this question, though, is, the way that it was asked. And if you talk to sort of the regular Chinese person, it's not necessarily about a moral judgment on the war, but it's like, is it in China's national interest, right? So they're sort of speaking from, pure interest, pragmatic interest of the country. And it does seem to me that I would say probably definitely over half of Chinese people I know personally, and you can see these views very evidently on social media, do support the Russian side. And a lot of it's because, Russia is a close neighbor, very long border with China. There is a lot of anti-Western sentiment already. So versus supporting someone who is sort of, what many Chinese people would consider unambiguously their enemy, seems to be, AKA the West, seems to be less wise of an idea than at least staying neutral or maybe mildly supportive of the Russian side. But as Pin has said, the rhetoric does seem to have shifted over time, right? So I know it's 2 months, 2 very long months, but you can definitely see that the sentiment, the public sentiment, has gone from, I think, what I initially felt like was sort of shockingly pro-Russia to now where it's much more nuanced and there's a diversity of opinion. On the sort of like just my personal circle of, let's call it well-educated tech entrepreneurs, I think the sort of that circle and, investors, that circle has a much more closely aligned view with with what we have here in the West, which is much more sympathetic to, I think, Ukraine, and then having generally just like wishing for peace and very much against the Russian invasion.
Yeah, it really does beg the question, doesn't it, Ray, that, whether this is the Chinese general population thinking that they're going to get some benefits, that taking a pro-Russia position is going to actually benefit China in some way. Although, as you pointed out before, the tech market is actually quite small. So like, what exactly is the benefit versus is the benefit actually just being anti-US, right? So that sort of begs that question. Let's take a pause real quick. I want to bring in. Let's bring in the questions from the audience. We've got a few that are queued up, but also let's invite back Craig Allen and Mary Teagarden to get them back into the discussion, especially because this first question, it's a bit of a Washington, D.C. question. So I'm going to throw it first to the panel and see if anybody wants to grab it. But if not, I think it's going to go to you, Craig, by default. But the first question is from the audience is what could have been done to prevent the war from happening in the first place? President Trump offered his point of view that the war would not have happened if he had been in office. What are your insights on this statement? I'll offer it first to the panel. Anybody want to grab that? Otherwise, it's a little bit of a hot potato. I'm going to throw it to Craig if nobody throws up their hand. Craig, do you want to take it?
So, was the war avoidable? What could we have done? Maybe the war wasn't avoidable. The Russian-Ukraine relationship is long and complex, and so it's not like this was a bilateral U.S.-Russia or U.S.-Ukrainian relationship. Let's also remember that President Trump stopped weapon sales or threatened to stop weapon sales to Ukraine for personal or political advantage. And And that's something that I think that is worthy of reflecting on. Now, one could postulate that during the Clinton era, when Madeleine Albright was Secretary of State, that we should not have pushed NATO through the 13 countries that I mentioned earlier. But you could make the other argument also that if NATO had been accepted Ukraine as a member, then we would not have had this problem. So at least in my view, this is not caused by NATO. It's not caused by the United States. It's caused by fantasies in Vladimir Putin's head about the Russian nation and a nostalgia for the glory days of the Soviet Union. And so I'm not sure that anything could have stopped this. And I think that that's the reason why it's so important to stop it now, because the invasion of Ukraine were allowed to persist. Does anybody think that that would be the last one? Would that not just invite a further aggression on the part of a victorious Vladimir Putin? And that's why this is so important that this end with Ukrainian sovereignty intact and with full support for Ukrainian reconstruction by all, and hopefully a lesson to Russia that this is not a good idea. Thank you.
You know, and anybody else want to chime in on that one? And also I'll offer another one. Isn't part of this issue here just a fundamental disagreement about the nature of NATO? And I get into these conversations with my friends in China all the time, that they fundamentally don't agree or accept or know that the mechanisms of NATO are defensive in nature, and there's no real mechanism for NATO to organize itself to proactively attack another country. Am I right about that? Or does anybody else want to comment on that? Maybe Craig first, and then anybody else who wants to comment on that, especially from the China perspective, because that seems to be a big part of the disconnect.
NATO is a defensive alliance with Article 5 noting that an attack on one is an attack by all. But Vladimir Putin doesn't care about that. And he has spun the story that NATO's advancement into Ukraine was inevitable, and that was an attack on Russia. That is untrue, but that is what Russian propaganda states. Stan would probably have the best views on this of anyone on this panel, I presume.
Yeah.
I mean, to add very briefly, so I agree with Craig that the moral and ethical responsibility for the war lies 100% with Putin and with the Kremlin. At the same time, I do think that the messaging from the West, particularly under the Bush administration, has perhaps exacerbated some of this Russian paranoia and propensities. So specifically, as Craig mentioned, the West could have accepted Ukraine into NATO. That was one scenario. But if they didn't do that, they should have kept silent on the issue. What they ended up doing is the worst. They didn't accept Ukraine into NATO. And at the same time, they signaled that this might be a potential option in the future. And of course, what happened under the previous Ukrainian president, Poroshenko, they wrote their aspiration to join NATO into the Ukrainian constitution. That is, they enshrined a provocation to Russia in their constitution. And, perhaps the signaling from the US administration could have been better on this issue.
Interesting. So would it be fair to say that's a failure of strategic ambiguity, which, or is that fair?
Yes, I mean, strategic ambiguity comes in different shapes and forms. And in the case of Taiwan, it's something entirely different than if you signal to a country that, you know what, the door is open, we're not actually admitting you, but why don't you keep trying? And this hasn't worked well. This is what triggered Putin. And, to deliver his 2007, I believe, at the Munich Security Conference, he basically railed against Western and NATO aggression as a result of that particular signaling towards Ukraine and Georgia by the Bush administration.
Okay, we have probably time for one last question, and it also comes from the audience. And this is a question we've kind of covered it, but we'll go deeper in it. But the question is, why is China unofficially choosing Russia's side when their economic ties to the West are much higher, stronger? And again, Ray, you've addressed this a bit, but feel free to dig in. And also, while you're at it, either Ray or Pin. And also maybe if you have comments about what we just said about NATO, because that's really, as Craig mentioned, he cited Article 5 says, an attack on one. But I hear this a lot from my Chinese friends that they just don't believe it. They think NATO is much more than a defensive alliance. Pin,
I would agree with you 100% because from the conversation with all the other people that, including my parents, for example, and their belief of NATO is military alliances. There's no word in any of their discussion about the defense alliances. So there's a big disconnection here. Obviously, the logical argument was that when Soviet Union was dissolved, and so what the NATO is there for, right? So for all that many years, and whether it's a messaging issue or it's a disconnection, the image for NATO is that it's a military alliance that is keep expanding to the east. So that is one major issue, I think. And unfortunately, frankly speaking, that sometimes it is a very sad, because it is clearly written in the NATO's documentation, but the newspaper or the media doesn't talk about that.
Yeah, they just don't, and people just don't believe it. It's sort of willful ignorance. Mary, do you have a thought on that? I'm reading your body language. You want to contribute, and this will probably wrap us up. We're already over time, but Mary, what are your thoughts?
On NATO specifically, my dad was around when it was formed, was involved in the formation of NATO. And it was the year I was born. And I grew up with stories about the peacekeeping role of NATO as opposed to the militaristic role of NATO. And I still cling to that ideal of the founders of NATO, but I can see how it could be perceived as a threat because the partners are all powerful partners. And I cling to the hope for peace in the region, and peace for China, Russia, the US, all of the major players in the world.
You know what, Mary, I think you speak for all of us with that statement, and that's a perfect way to kind of wrap this up on that thought, Mary. So thank you for that. And with that, let me, on behalf of USF and CBSI, I want to thank everybody here. The speakers have been fantastic. Really appreciate your time and your insight on all of this. So huge thanks to all of you. We'll give you a virtual clap. Also, and as we wrap up, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Professor Vivian Faustino. These events, they seem very easy because they're on Zoom and we can do them from our living room, but believe it or not, there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes, and that's all Vivian and her team. So I will hand off with our thanks, Vivian, for setting this up and getting it going with our thanks, and then I'll hand off to you to conclude our program. Vivian?
Thank you so much, Kerr. And again, thank you very much to all our panelists, to all the moderators. Thank you so much for all this insight and all this very interesting conversation we had today. We received so many questions from the early registrants, more than 20 questions, but unfortunately we ran out of time. But we can send you the link. You send us your email addresses so we can send over the link to this conversation, because many of those were also discussed in the discussion or in the panel. I'd like to again Thank you, Kerr, our moderator today. And of course, as he mentioned, it always takes a village. So our technical team led by Daniel, Tanya, and Adam, and everyone from the School of Management who supported us in making this event possible. Our gratitude to our audience who joined us today, and for those who asked and sent us those highly relevant questions. We are looking forward to having you again next month as we host a global conference on reshaping international operations for carbon neutrality in turbulent times. This will be hosted by East China University of Science and Technology, Nottingham University Business School of China, and University of San Francisco. So you could save the date, June 9th, 2022, and it's still virtual. And please follow us on LinkedIn, and also on our website, we could post there on how to join us for that next event. And with that, we now conclude this event, and I wish you a pleasant afternoon and have a good week ahead. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Much. Bye-bye.